Are you ready for the next speaker? All right, super. Our next speaker coming in remotely is going to be talking about using video games to subvert player expectations. Give it up for Limpho Moeti.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I'm coming live from all the way in South Africa. I would have been there in person, but unfortunately, your State Department did not want to give me a visa. I think it's because I'm too awesome. So let's go right into it and talk about video games as a subversive art. And this is something I'm quite excited and passionate about. A little background on me is that I am a deputy festival director for an indie gaming and digital art festival in South Africa called Playtopia. And I used to work for a gaming company here for about 3 years, which is quite exciting. So I want to talk about the thing that I love about video games, which is making it subversive and forcing people to think about how we interact in the world, how we interact with other people, and why we should go out of our way as game devs to make video games subversive. Okay, so I'm going to keep shouting next slide, and I kind of hope that you see the slides that I see when I say that. So, after my first slide, next slide. Okay, so this is about what do we mean by subversion. So as you can see on the text, it's about subverting the existing values, institutions. It's about subverting expected mores and taboos and norms within our society. So this talk is, sorry, I'm very nervous. This talk is pretty much inspired by a book I read like a decade ago called Film as a Subversive Art, and talked about how film is the most powerful tool of the century. And honestly, in the 21st century, the most powerful tool is video games. Because it's not just that we're watching people do things and feeling connected to them doing things, but in gaming, we do things. If we're playing Electronic Arts Shoot 'em Up 2000, or as I like to call it, Grizzled Brunette 29. We're the ones gunning people down in a first-person shooter. We're the ones making decisions in a game that affect the world around us within a video game. And for that, we are 100% the protagonists, and it affects us more when it's us doing the thing than by just simply watching someone doing the thing. And for that reason, as you can see with my talk with a very questionable slide, um, so next slide, if anyone's hearing me, is that that subversion is deeply important, right? It grows the medium, it forces us to try new things, to see what video gaming can do and how it can affect how we see the world. But more importantly, I think it's important to accept that video games can affect how we see the world. Not in the sense that playing a video game will make you more misogynistic or racist, or playing a game will make you, hate people, but rather the way in which we play games affects how we see the world. And a great example of that is just outrage culture. You know, someone says something problematic, someone does something problematic online, and on Twitter or social media of any kind, we all gang up together and cause the person who said something problematic to lose their jobs. We cause them to maybe not be online anymore, and we move on to the next thing as though we're beating the boss, this person who exudes or is the personification of racism or sexism, and we move on to the next thing, like we're moving on to the next level, from level 1 to level 2. And we don't realize that immediately, but it's a very important part of how we play games. So I quickly want to talk about 3 ways that we can subvert that, and how games subvert our expectations as players and as creators, and why that's important. Okay, so next slide. I want to talk about one of my favorite games. It's called DOKI Literature Club. It is very, very basically a Japanese simulating dating simulator game where you are a player, usually a man, because who cares about cis heteronormativity? Good luck to anyone trying to say that word on the prompter. Um, but it's a game where you're a guy and you have these four beautiful women and you join a literature club and you want them to fall in love with you. It's very basic. It's very, very heteronormative. But what this game does spectacularly is that it subverts structural and both game playing expectations. So, spoilers if you haven't played this 2-year-old game, but it's a horror game. So this is a game where you make people fall in love with you, but something to do with mental illness happens to you and or happens to the characters, everyone you fall in love with, and it becomes quite uncomfortable and quite intense to play. So next slide, let's talk about it. Within the game, one of the first characters commits suicide. So I'm really sorry for not having trigger warnings. I'm quite nervous about talking to a crowd in New York. But one of the characters does something horrific, and so then they get deleted from the game. So when you see the first slide versus this slide, there is literally pixelated art that is an amalgamation of all three other uh, characters in the game that becomes the fourth character. This is a game that both manages to break the fourth wall and makes you feel and reminds you consistently that you're playing a game. And it is also a game that deals impressively well with mental illness, with uncomfortability, whether it's self-harm or depression. And I find that quite impressive. And it's great because it forces you to question being in a game. And for the people, shout out to DOKI Literature Club fans who've played the game. We're going to go to the next slide, which reminds you that this game is really all just Monica and how it creates that uncomfortability with this very basic design, with very basic narrative game, but it forces you to really think about being a player in the game and how you affect the world by the decisions you make every time. No matter how many times you play it, there's one time you can get a happy ending, but every decision you make has a deep impact in the world. And I love that kind of structural subversion because it reminds you that every single thing you do in real life has an impact. So the next game I want to talk about in terms of subversion really is just an excuse for me to complain about first person shooters and war games that are totally or and no shame. I'm not in New York. You guys can't fight me. So the game that I'm going to choose is Spec Ops: The Line. This is an amazing game because you are supposed to be American soldiers going into Dubai after a huge natural disaster and saving the people of Dubai with the power of guns and freedom. But in But in actual fact, it is a game about PTSD and the effect that war has on you as a human being and how it changes your reactions to situations when you're on the front line, which is deeply important because we live in a society that glorifies war and violence. And so having this game that is very much your FPS, shoot 'em up, but forces you to live what it's like to have PTSD. And spoiler for an 8-year-old game, but you realize that the big bad that you've been fighting against is dead and has been dead since before your, Black Ops team arrived. Is also a game that makes you question the idea of like committing war crimes for the greater good, which I think is deeply important and very amazing. I'm definitely going to go over my time, but again, The organizers of this festival can't yell at me because I'm still in South Africa, so yay me. The final game I want to talk about, again, within this theme of me raging against war games, is a game called Attentant 1942. This, next slide. This is a game that is about being a civilian in 1942 in the Czech Republic, where your game objective is to find out why the Gestapo has arrested your grandfather. It's a game that is genuinely realistic to what war is like. I think that within the AAA world, we are told that realism is the guns and the boots and the mud and the grass, but genuinely realism is looking at how war affects everyday people, people who are not soldiers, who are not on the oh God, the word has completely escaped me, but you're not on the front line of a war. And I think that's deeply important. I think that it's very easy to lose context of what fascism or what an authoritarian regime means when you are consistently told that it's just a cool war game and then you get to go back to your normal life and don't understand the context around war. Next slide. So one of my favorite things is you are a civilian in this game and you're just trying to survive Nazi occupation. You're trying to understand why the Gestapo is against you, but you're a civilian at a time when an SS officer has been assassinated in your country, and now there are these giant reprisals, and you're fighting against it and living with the real world consequences of that. So I'll go to my last slide, which is just showing you how the game works and the kind of things you do, which is quite exciting. And then finally, my final slide says any questions, but really it should have all of my social media stuff. But the reason this is important to me is because we are now living in a world where Nazis are a thing again, fascism is a thing again, and it feels like, particularly if you're a person of color, there isn't an ability to control that. But the reason I chose this talk for this event is because I do want to remind you that there is control for it, that you can still make a fun, enjoyable game that is incredibly gripping and force people to think consistently about what they're doing and how their actions have an impact on the world. So I really hope that you can take this away. The sound sounded great. I look cute. And you can think about how the games you make are impactful and can subversively force people to think about the world in which we live. Because we're in gaming because we love it and we want to make something amazing. So thank you very, very much for listening to my talk all the way from South Africa. And hopefully in 2020, I can be there on stage and you can come to me afterwards and ask me questions and have a couple of shots and drinks with me. Thank you so much, GDoC, for having me. You guys are amazing. Good night.
Keep it going for Limpho, coming to us all the way from South Africa.
Limpho Moeti, Southern African thing. I'm so sorry I didn't have a chance to explain to anyone. It's Limpho Moeti. I love you all. I'm obsessed with you. Good night.
We love you too.